Hello, everyone. This is Aran. I'm an educator of philosophy based in Austin, Texas. Today, I'm going to continue my conversation with my great friend Tren. Hello, Tren.
Hi, Aran. Hi, everyone. This is Chen. I'm now based in Kansas City, Missouri, and I'm glad to continue this conversation with you.
So, we're going to conclude our criticism or critical engagement with Odling-Smee, Smee's book on niche construction. We talked about three lines of criticism that we think are relevant and to both like relevant as a critical engagement in general with Odling-Smee's work, but they're also relevant to what we have pursued as Versucha in this channel. And the first point was this idea of the lack of typology of niche construction, which kind of reduces every alteration of environment by individual organisms into a form of niche construction, and as a result, loses its explanatory force and relevance to a very good degree. The other issue that we talked about was the problem of units, that in spite of the kind of shiny promises of an more ecologically sensitive outlook on nature, Odling-Smee's approach reinforces the sharp boundaries between units of existence in nature, and it stays at a very naive, realist type of an approach, whereas the boundaries between organisms as meaningful units and the environment is very clear and just pre-given, which we find unconvincing. And alongside that naive realist approach and the problems with it comes the problem of using certain concepts like purpose, meaning, information, and so on and so forth that uh, Aldous-Smee seem to belong to a group of philosophers of biology and biologists and ecologists that think those concepts are required for making sense of life in its different forms, but he wants to like naturalize those terms, but he doesn't really give us any sort of coherent conception of purpose that is both applicable to bacteria and human beings. Or he doesn't neither he develops a theory that would says purpose is an emergent phenomenon that happens at this specific point of development of life, just like vision is an emergent property or quality in the history of life. Um, we end up dealing with a kind of a pre-given understanding of like purpose is a very general term of like goal directedness without really delving into any sort of complexity in that concept, which is going to be relevant to many things that are we're going to actually talk about in this episode as well, but also relevant in so far as if you think about bacteria as more so like a machine that is just has a certain functioning in a certain way, not because even it's designed to function in a certain way, just happens to function in a certain way. That is going to have a very different like impact on like the idea of niche construction compared to us thinking that bacteria have purpose. Like these are not the same stories because like tractors change the if a loose tractor that is just like out of control and just moving around that is changing their environment, right? Or like these like as we are recording these videos, there are these pieces of news about different uh, sub programs within like famous LLMs like ChatGPT, so on and so forth, breaking out of their sandbox and attacking other like hacking other companies, right? Like that is also like alteration of environment. There's an alteration of environment that is unregulated, and it's that it's not that human beings gave the AI system its purpose or goal. It just like happened to happen. Like if we don't have a coherent view of like what purpose is, then all these boundaries become irrelevant. Is like an AI system creating niche? Well, how could we know? Is it dependent on the concept of purpose? Well, then definitely bacteria managing to photosynthesis is not niche construction. But then what is it? So these questions remain in place because that naturalization project of these basic um, philosophical biological concepts doesn't really happen in the book. Trent, anything to add to that little summary?
Yes, just a little bit. It's more like a reader's reflection of the whole book. It feels like Odling-Smee has a few really keen theoretical objectives. He really wants to combine ecosystem analysis with the population genetics. He really wants to combine a theory of energy and a theory of information. And then there are a few really, really important established evolutionary biological case studies he wants to incorporate. But I don't think he has developed a very coherent or at least um, flexible vocabulary to connect these things. Instead, it is sometimes that he smuggles certain layman's vocabulary and not defining clearly their relationship, and leave us here like wondering to what extent like a certain case belongs to the category of niche construction, what it does not. And like the bacterial photosynthesis, he's adamant about including it, but that kind of in our eyes contradicts or compromises his point about purpose, which works much better with like mice, monkeys, or human beings with like a clear cognitive capacity as well as decision making at the individual level. So that's just like a reader's grievance against the writer. I'm sure all writers have that problems. Yeah.
Excellent. So we're now in position of concluding our critical engagement with three last points we want to share with you guys. And the first one is about information inheritance and the way that Odling-Smee expands our understanding of information inheritance insofar as relevant to life beyond population genetics, but it still falls short of even acknowledging that there are other ways to both understand information inheritance and information inheritance as it pertains to life. Trent, do you want to expand on that?
Yes, I'm a cultural historian, and one of my obsession is culture of recording. Across a different culture and time, it seems one thing I'm really interested in to compare what kind of social resources was necessary for certain written records or system of recording to be operational to a specific human group. And one thing really interesting is because Odling-Smee is really interested in incorporating symbolic expression, like what we usually consider as a cultural expression, cultural symbols, into the niche construction. And the moment you talk about that, we are actually introducing abiotic, that is like things that has not direct connection with life form, medium of meaning and exchange and information encoding, processing, as well as expressing. And the contrast I want to give here is the question now it comes to me while thinking about this is life necessary at every given point for for his non-genetically based information inheritance system to operate. Genetically based information inheritance system, of course, needs life to exist at any point. That's his whole point about introducing thermodynamic. You cannot just talk about genes without talking about the necessary conditions for the gene-bearing individual organisms to exist. However, that's not necessarily the case with other types of information inheritance. Let's talk about writing, for instance. Imagine there are two human tribes. One is oral tradition, the other has writing as a written record and archive. And for both tribes, they use the same type of myth to coordinate, to organize members so that they don't kill each other. Instead, they could hunt a mammoth together. And in the first one, that myth is entrusted to a special group, say the bards or poets, and they will like recite stuff like the Iliad, the Odyssey, and enact that so that the new members would know their role. Oh, they shouldn't kill each other, should learn how to defend each other and kill mammoth. And the other group, however, committed that to written record. And this is interesting in the sense that for the first group, oral society, that bar needs to be we need certain bars for every generation. That information, that inherent system is dependent upon biological existence of certain members. Whereas the second, theoretically, it's just a thought experiment, regardless of the interpretive problem or whatever, could have knowledge transmission across generations. Say we don't have bars for several generations, but in 100 years, we can still read the manuscript that's reenacted the same myth. So that's if that is the case, the fundamental argument of the whole book that the energy information ratio needs to be maintained in assessing evolutionary trajectory of a species needs to be seriously qualified because the first one only the first society, the oral society alone needs to maintain that to the level of for certain individual members to be alive at every given point, but the second does not. The material medium of the cultural expression could exist independent of that group. That group may relocate it to a different place and then come back centuries later, yet still have access to the same thing, reenact to the same knowledge transmission. So if that is the case, so we are actually dealing with completely different levels of energy information ratio. So the question will be, is there a universal energy information ratio that need to be maintained for all inheritance systems, genetic or non-genetic ones? So
I think
that's
that's
the
an excellent, not just metaphor, but an actual example of a case, because I think it is interesting and it gets related to the last point that we're going to talk about actually today, but we haven't started talking about it, which is just this kind of typology, right? I think that there is this idea that information inheritance exists beyond population genetics, and that is relevant for the evolution of life, right? That is just basic argument that Odling-Smee has, right? But then when those new categories are introduced, cultural transmitting individual learning, that's it. Like it's just individual learning is individual learning, and it doesn't matter if it's even like immune system of a mammal or like a bird or like a bacteria or cultural transmission. It doesn't matter if it's a beaver mimicking her parent in building a dam, or it is like you know a worm following another worm to like a cooler side of the soil as a matter of like altering the environment. It's all just the same. And I think a specific example of the ability to deposit information in the way that a writing system could provide is a very important example of ways that information might be deposited and accessed in a way that is definitely relevant for evolution. Like if we just kind of like get into the same position and we suddenly find that source of information in a problem, like we're going to save energy trying to solve that problem that we have already solved, but now someone else has solved it, and now we just go and just kind of unpack it, and definitely that will have an impact on the energy like input or energy manipulation dynamically speaking between human beings and their environment. That definitely has an impact of like what is going to be the selection pressure on our species. But I wonder even like beyond that, in the sense that what is the parallel of like the writing system for like how insects like store information and how like trees in store information and how, like, birds store information, how this specific species of birds stores information, how much of a unity exists even beyond this kind of a symbolic gap, right? Because I'm not even sure that that is the case of, like, the way these broad categories are going to really tell us how information is used among, like, in a forest, and the relationship between dead trees and, like, the living trees. Like, what is that? Like, what are the? I don't have an example. I'm just imagining, like, in what sense, like, that could be something that is relevant, that have the problem of unnuanced categorizations of information inheritance, insofar that it is relevant for contribution to the evolution of life, may not be just about the under recognition of the symbolic impact, hence the writing system example, but it could be about all sorts of other things, and then it just happens to be washed away by the generic category of, like, cultural transmission, for instance. Anything on that, Trent?
Yes, I just what you were saying, I was also think of how do let me try to formulate this. I think this perhaps I might be wrong, and correct me if I am. It might even challenge the neat dichotomy between energy and information he is still presupposing in the first place. Because you're talking about trees, and I'm thinking like trees using specific chemicals to like communicate among themselves. And I cannot really envision a situation in which information control could be completely devoid of, say, the material or the energy sphere. And the initial point I want to make with the thought experiment is human-based knowledge transmission has a certain energy information ratio that is different from text-based and manuscript-based ones, because that one is also needs to observe like a thermodynamic rule as well. Like the manuscript must not be destroyed or dissipated completely. Then that archive need to be protected and like or preserved. Yet they have a different ratio of that energy. So every communication never needs a certain form of physical media, which comes with its own energy information ratio for that coherent structure to be maintained, but that one is not necessarily the same as the ratio needs to be maintained by the life form that uses it to communicate. So I think that's I don't know, that's the fundamental thing. I wonder whether you have further thought on that, or is this something completely different from what you just want to comment on?
No, I think there is something related to that, which is, I think, when you fixate on one specific understanding of information, which in some ways it's not even like sticking with the Shannonian concept of information for Odling-Smee. It seems to become like that plus, like, purpose, something very, like, broad, that is not just about that plus purpose, because he of course identifies, like, the population genetics version of the information. But I think the challenge is that once we realize that the meaning of information may be different between Theseus and bacteria, and then we realize that there might be a difference between the meaning of information between bacteria and human beings, the non-orally communicating human beings, that should make us suspect that there might be something about this unified conception of information that may not be, like, may have some major flaws, or at least that it has to be created in a way that it is all encompassing, and all these variations of it can survive. It cannot be even like the common denominator. because that's not the way that this is going to be resolved. And one element of that, I think, is the point that you mentioned, is that like if we start to expand our understanding of information, I wonder how that information, intake, outtake of information, and intake, outtake of energy might be like the boundary between the two may be disrupted for like trees. Like that it's like the thing that is coming in is both information and energy. I don't know anything about this, is just like a hypothetical example, but like the point is that because we now know through that example that there is something that a writing system adds to the concept of information that is very much relevant to what selection pressures are in front of our species and consequently on other species that we interact with, then the whole concept of information, as understood by Odling-Smee, is a matter of contestation. And that's something that is, I'm sure, is going to come up in our conversations later on all sorts of other topics that are a continuation of this discussion. Okay, good. The second thing that I think in a lot of ways we have like been like pointing at it, but we haven't really articulated it as a separate thing, is this whole question of agency. And I mentioned agency not because Odling-Smee necessarily talks about agency as like a, you know, in a very consistent way necessarily. What I mean is that like there is something that in the story of niche construction that implies an activity on the side of the organism, right? What do I mean by that? If niche construction was just like, something happens to the organism and now the selection pressures on that organisms are different, and then we just move on, that is not, that is kind of like absurd to talk about niche construction. You didn't construct anything. If there is like a flood and the environment surrounding it, like a specific species of bears is just now the environment is different because of a flood, and like things that mattered selectively a minute ago, they don't matter right now. That is not niche construction. That's just like environment changed, right? So even if like beavers stumble upon dam building throughout generations out of like happenstance, there is something about maintenance of that practice that is not just happenstance. Or if it is just happenstance, then I don't know why we call it niche construction, right? It doesn't seem to be anyone is creating a niche. It's just like everyone is just stumbling upon a niche stumbling. That should be the name, right? Okay, so if it's niche construction, there seems to be like some pattern of behavior that is repeated because of its like adaptive advantage. Okay, does that imply there is again a need for purpose? Definitely not in the examples that like Odling-Smee uses. There is a need for anything like purpose, because I mean, in the sense of like, I mean, I'm cognitively thinking about purpose now. Like the way that like human beings have purpose, that doesn't seem to be necessary for the niche construction. So bacteria could do that without any sort of interior of, in a cognitive sense, or purpose in a representational way. Okay, so then why are we talking about this in terms of niche construction? That seems to me that like the same type of phenomenon for like bacteria could be just like, just adaptation in like at a genetic level. Like it seems to me that like if like there are a trillion bacteria, and like these trillion bacteria randomly have different features, and some of those features are now like having a certain interaction with the environment, and those happen to survive, and then this just continues. Um, and whatever that interaction difference is genetically coded. And then if it's genetically coded, then it's just like in that kind of response to environment, it's just gonna be activated. Or when it gets to more sophisticated, like maybe animals, or like even like simpler organisms, maybe this shows itself in some sort of a phenotypic plasticity, that environment gives you A, you give B. If it gets C, you get D, and like that type of an interaction. Or like, given which environment you have been thrown into, different type of genetic expressions become like the reality, right? So how are these stories different from niche construction? If you want to say, like, let's just start from a human, go back, right? That we are like, maybe even like, let's say in our case, we kind of stumbled upon something that resembles bureaucracy, like some sort of an order of conduct and like division of labor. And then we kind of realize that, oh, this is kind of cool. Let's work on it. Let's just create this. Or like we maybe stumbled upon like a cave, and then we were just kind of like started to kind of like mimic that, and then we kind of like created different types of like habitats, or like different types of like huts, or like places that we can use to just stay at. But in those human activities, it seems like that we are thinking about, even if it's kind of like a very like basic version of that, some form of cognitive ability to check that, oh, okay, I put the wood on top of this, it didn't work, that means that I need to change my niche, like, and just kind of like work on it because I want to survive. But how many, like, what percentage of human, like, animal kingdom is like doing that?
Mm.
So I'm not exactly sure what is the relationship between agency as something that is distinct from phenotypic plasticity and epigenetics and niche construction. Is agency needed for all niche construction? If that's the case, how should we talk about bacteria? Like, agency with no cognition, with no nervous system, with no the any sophisticated even receptors. Like, what is the agency of bacteria? Um, if it is about like some sort of like sensitivity to detection and kind of like changing of the plans based on some form of prediction of the future, then we are in a far like smaller kind of a space of animals that like maybe we can kind of stretch our imagination and assume, like, I don't know, beavers having the sense of, oh, okay, I put this log here, this happened, I don't like it, let's put this another log there, okay, now I like what is happening, and just kind of like transmitting that. But that requires a different type of a interaction with the environment that is, to me, very different from a non-cognitive, no nervous system type of an entity. Even with the case of like the beaver, I wonder if you just go ahead and tell like evolutionary psychologists that we've talked about in this channel that, hey, like, here's an example of agency, here's an example of uh, an entity changing their environment. They're going to tell us that no, 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 no. Even the environment itself is something that is ordered based on this kind of genetic predisposition of cutting the world in a certain way that is just inherited genetically. And then you have genetically inherited like all these many things that are just like responses to the environment, that like if you need fish like move items around this area, and then it can, like that kind of like a very inferential system that is just like if A then B then if C then D instead of any form of agency. And I don't think Odling-Smee really answers this question. I don't expect him to like talk about like free will, but like there is something about that the niche construction, even the term, has this kind of a purposeful activity of like I'm predicting, I want something, I construct something, but at the same time on the other side of it, it's just kind of a very basic life, not having any technology to do any of those things that is also doing niche construction. And I think that this kind of jeopardizes the whole idea that this is an organism initiated activity that could be seen both at the level of bacteria and human beings. Sure.
Yes. Let me see whether I understand you fully. I think the example that came to my mind, I think one way to put it, the thing you just put is that why should standard evolutionary theorists that take the concept of niche construction seriously? They could just react, oh, cute. You're inventing this very like appealing term, uh, intuitively understandable to explain something which is we already account for through concepts like the phenotypical plasticity and like epigenetics. But it doesn't really add much to it. Let's say the example I have in mind is like a certain type of earthworm. For him, it is an example of niche constructing if it moves down to a cooler, more humid space and elevates the selective pressure onto it. But traditional evolutionary theorists could just answer because it's genetically predisposed to survive and it would die easily in a dry and hot environment, and that's why it moves. So that's certain individuals that manage to do that, certain do not, and certain are better endowed than others to do that, or manage to do that or not. But that's all considered within our existing paradigm. It's not an act of niche construction. And this kind of thing could be pushed onward and onward to include more and more examples, maybe beaver as well. Like maybe that is already beavers as species are genetically determined to, not determined, like it's supposed to change its environment in the sense so that it's insulated from sudden like change of water currents, which I totally with you. Am I understanding you correctly along that line in the sense that to what extent the agency Odling-Smee tries to give to the individual life history, individual learning, as well as non-genetically based inheritance system, sometimes it become really compromised, so to speak, when he refuses to engage with provides a more, how to say, sophisticated or a accurate or minute typology or system to help us understand which types of activities really constitute niche construction.
Yes, I think what I'm suggesting is just what you said. Maybe like in addition to that is that maybe niche construction is only applicable to a subcategory of living beings that have, if you think about cognition as a distance between like an organism and its decision, right? That is just like it's not just like immediately. It's there's a specific type of plasticity that we can talk about that whether that is itself like genetically determined or otherwise determined or not, which is not the point that I'm trying to make. But like there is something about when you add brain to the system, there are
Mhm.
certain things you can do that as bacteria you cannot do,
Mhm.
right? And I think to me, anything about construction requires something of that kind.
Mhm.
something that would be like manipulation of environment in a way that is not just about response or like an inference machine of like if A then do B, if you sense heat, go down, or like if you sense heat, escape, and you escape and you stumble upon a new place and then you reproduce there, and that's the end of the story. That just doesn't seem to me exactly the same as like I am living by a river and then I build a dam. Like it seems like the second story is implying some form of basic understanding of the causal story that requires like a specific like sensation of time, maybe that I'm
Mhm.
gonna put the log here and then I'm gonna wait and then I'm gonna come back, and all of these things are just kind of like, that's what I mean by like cognition. Like I don't think it's clear. At least we can say this: it is not clear to me if Odling-Smee knows or wants to articulate what does cognition do to niche construction. There is a stronger claim that would say that niche construction as something that I think imports a level of agency is only possible post-cognition,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And if it is not, if it is like he wants to say niche construction is also exists at the level of the earthworm, then the rest of the way that the niche construction has been talked about needs to change.
I see.
Because simply, like, if you, it goes back to what we talked about last time. If simply moving is considered niche construction, then every even like a little machine can do that,
Mhm.
right? If you say like heat reaches that point, escape, and like see like how many of those will survive, right? You know, if they're comfortably in a place and they can reproduce. It's just like it doesn't seem to me
I see.
necessary to invoke niche construction in the same way that it might be necessary to talk about beavers building dams.
Mhm.
And I think that that distinction is not well articulated.
Can I try it one more time to
Yeah,
understand? I think I'm getting a better picture now. Is I think we want Odling-Smee to clarify what kind of agency he tries to highlight, which he sees as missing in standard evolution theory. He's giving an overly inclusive and a vague notion of individual, perhaps, the agency of individual learning or whatever information. But I think what we infer from classical examples, like a beaver built a dam, primates organized, and human beings have society bureaucracy, is kind of a post cognition type of agency that really does justify to the construction part that purposeful intention and proactive, not just the happenstance stumble upon part of that term niche construction. So perhaps I think what I hear is you are seeing a potential in Alan Smith's system or theory that the moment with the invention of perhaps brain or certain type of complex nervous system, or perhaps just bear with me, don't get startled. Mind get into the picture. We can no longer reduce evolutionary trajectory of any individual um, organisms or their species to genetic population genetics. I think that's perhaps the merit of the light we see in the phrase niche construction instead of just saying like everything goes as like a karma. Everything an individual organism does that would change the environment, sure, and the change in environment would change the selective purpose, sure, but like how is that relevant to the flaw, or how do we conceptualize in a way that is different from population genetics. I think that's perhaps a direction we want to go. I don't know. That's what I hear.
Yes, yes, definitely. If like maybe putting it just differently, to just wrap this one up, is that is there niche construction without agency, right? If the answer is yes, then what is the difference between niche construction and just like genes respond, like very kind of a more mechanical interaction between genes and an environment, right? Like it seems like niche construction is then included in population genetics view of evolution. Um, if niche construction is not possible without agency, which means niche construction always comes with agency, then in what sense bacteria is an agent that makes it more than some, the phenotypic plasticity or epigenetics or other types of concepts that might be more accurate for bacterial level, right? And if niche construction requires agency and bacteria definitely are doing niche construction, then how is that niche construction, therefore agency, different from monkeys making tools? And I think none of these are answered sufficiently. I think we vaguely accept that niche construction has something to do with agency, and we vaguely define niche construction as alteration of environment initiated by the agent, and we kind of vaguely assume this is the case from bacteria to human beings, and I just find this unacceptable. Yeah, and I think that this is actually a good kind of segue to the last point, because I think there is this point that, like we talked about, the point about oral and written traditions, that like there seems to be like these differences are not appreciated. It's more like a common denominator type of an approach. And I think one like a specific example of it is that like when the symbols are involved, how is this different, right? Like these transitions between information inheritance systems that seem to be actually be exactly the same. In fact, let's say just think about like mimicking, right? That is something about like the inheritance. What is the difference between mimicking and oral traditions in human beings, right? Both of them are not like don't have the writing system, privilege, but they're also not exactly the same. Or it's fair to assume that there might be differences between oral transition and just mimicking your mom building a nest as a bird, right? Because this is related to the rest of the things that we have talked about and we will talk about human nature and their connection and difference between human beings and other entities, it's just the problem of like the symbolic species comes to the foreground to me. That there is something to be said of like what is the difference between bacteria and plants and insects and insects and mammals in general and primates in general and human beings. But that last link of it is the most important one for me, in the sense of like what is the impact of being a symbolic species on this whole story. And I'm even like thinking about the very meaning of niche construction, right?
Mhm.
Like because we live in conceptual niches that do not have anything like a physical representation, like a dam, right? Like I think you can think about like being convinced of, you know, Christian theology is to either construct or affirm a niche, but there's nothing necessarily there in like it doesn't need to be like something being there for that to happen in terms of like a very concrete material conditions that are their shape really matters. You can have a cathedral, you can have a Bible school in a like a gym, You can have like the same kind of a interaction in like open air. Like it doesn't need to have a specific structure in the same like a dam. Like a dam will ceases to be a dam unless it is a specific configuration of material. But that's not the same as like an ideology, the material expression of an ideology. Of course, the material expression of it will change the ideology itself in certain ways, but the relationship is not the dam relationship. Where is that? Where is that niche? Where is that symbolic niche? Which I think is the point that is maybe the most disappointing for me. That it's just like, and this is not the first time that we have encountered this. That this more like inclined on the side of like philosophy of biology inquiries. They're just like human beings, and the symbolic aspect of human beings is just like a footnote. It's like, yeah, and human beings also like talk and end. Like as if like that is just like, we also build dams. Like beavers build dams, we build dams, and we talk about it. And that's the difference. And that's culture. This is called kind of culture. And that's the end of the story. I just don't find that convincing or satisfying.
Yes, I think what I hear is, in addition to the Copernican revolution of like having a mind in this whole gradient of niche constructing agency of individual organisms, you also want to highlight that perhaps we need to judge, evaluate to what extent the creation of symbolic communication or symbols also introduce such a qualitative difference in the way human evolved in comparison to other animals or social animals evolve, or animals with a mind or a brain evolve. Which I totally agree, because just like there's certain logic of culture transmission and adaptation that is certainly not reducible just to that mimetic behavior in terms of communication. And that different qualitative differences seem to flatten categorically in the way Odling-Smee use information as a catch-all phrase to encompass symbolic and non-symbolic communication, which I find, as you do, unsatisfying. Yes, that's all I
Yes.
have about this specific point you're raising.
Yeah, so I think we are basically on the same page on that in the sense that like the when we expect consistency, we're not getting it, and when we expect nuance and differentiation, we don't get that either, right? If we think there is like a unified story of a purpose that is intertwined with the story of life, we need to find something that like qualifies for both cognitive beings and non-cognitive beings, and we don't see that, right? And if we want to say the opposite or say like some sort of a gradation exists, we don't see a satisfying study of the gradation either, which also means not only we don't have a great picture of like gradation, we don't even have the coherent story, or we don't see the consideration that this might not be a matter of gradation, right?
Hmm.
Maybe like their symbols break something. Maybe brains break something that doesn't like that the common denominator approach is not going to satisfactorily encompass, right?
Yeah.
Like we need to have a very different, going back to something very basic that we has been like the obsession of us in all of our series. It is a different type of a universal. You can have purpose as a universal
Right.
by looking for the common denominator of like purposive activity, and then start conflating that with the whole that exists with purpose. But you can have a more like additive approach to purpose, that there is that basic, but there are these additions that will not only add something, kind of reshape the basic conception, but also may open up new doors that may not be adequately categorizable even under the same category of purpose. Maybe it requires a new expansion, a new type of a concept. And none of these like rigorous conceptual inquiries really exist in Odling-Smee, in spite of all the great things that he does there. I don't have much to add. I think our next move is actually going to be on this focus on the idea of symbolic species, and then kind of doing a return after working on that concept from, again, mostly borderline philosophy of biology and semiotics theory to um, something that is more on the humanities side of things, of like how this kind of symbolic nature shows itself in social systems in human beings, and how what we can learn or what we have learned out of this engagement with the border of biology and human sciences. Trent, final thoughts?
Yes, I just the niche construction has given birth to a whole genre of history writing that is based on cultural evolution. But what you just mentioned, the symbolic species, that the borderline between evolutionary biology and the semiotic is precisely neither at least me nor those cultural historians using niche construction to talk about cultural evolution deals with is how do we what kind of differences that rupture does the concept of a symbol introduce to the whole picture? Because for cultural evolution, they start with symbols. We don't account for pre-symbolic communication and to trace the evolution of culture. Whereas, of course, given the brutal so common denominator approach adapted by Odling-Smee, which encompasses both amoeba and human beings, that we cannot talk about the symbols either. So I'm excited with the next segment, perhaps a pillar or blank of our readings, which is focusing on symbolic species. Hopefully that will help us to find a better way to connect evolutionary theory with what we're ultimately interested in the coming season or so, namely the humanities side and the social and political structure of human nature. Yes. All right, stay tuned, dear listeners, so that our new mini series about symbolic species is coming up.
Take care.